The Sicilian Defense is widely recognized as the best defense for black against d4. Today, I'm going to teach you how to play in under 10 minutes. Of course, I can't cover the entire Sicilian in one video as that is far too many variations, this many in fact, but I will teach you about a specific, secret variation that wins games even against world champions. Welcome to the O'Kelly Sicilian. We start off with e4, c5, knight f3, and a6. This is the starting position of the O'Kelly. It prevents bishop b5 check from happening, which is very important, and I'll explain why later. The most common move here is d4, and it's actually a bad move. It scores less than 45% for white, but it's super common, and even grandmasters play it. Okay, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and now we play e5, kicking this knight up. Now is a good time to point out why a6 is crucial, because if we played the same variation but started off with d6 instead of a6, after reaching this position, white has the annoying bishop b5 check, which leaves us in a worse position. Okay, back to the game. The knight can go back to either f3 or b3. There are minor nuances, and I'm going to cover both variations later, but this doesn't really matter right now because we're going to play bishop b4 regardless, pinning this knight and applying pressure on this e4 pawn. Now, if white plays a dumb move like bishop e2, we just play knight takes c4, and since the knight is pinned, we are now up a pawn and winning the game. At this point, white has 4 different moves. I think now is a good time to say that instead of filling up your brain with 6,000 different moves of theory, I'm going to try and explain the idea of the opening instead, so that if you see a move you're not familiar with, you'll be able to find a good response on your own because you understand the point of the opening. Cool? Okay then, let's continue. If any of these 4 moves happen, the most common of which is bishop d2, just play d6. Why? Because d6 is a good move. Why? Because it opens up your bishop and adds a defender to your e5 pawn. Now, white is probably going to play one of the 4 moves previously mentioned, such as bishop d2. Friendly reminder that if your opponent is stupid and plays bishop e2, you can win a pawn. Now we play knight bd7. Why? Because it's a good move. Why? Because it prepares knight c5, which pressures the bishop and the pawn that we are targeting. Now, important note, in this exact same position, but with the knight on b3 instead, don't play knight bd7 because if white is smart, white will force a bishop trade, and then if you put your knight on c5, white will take it and you will lose a pawn, which obviously would not be possible when the knight was on f3. Instead, play bishop e6 and then follow with knight c6. Try to castle as soon as you can, and if your opponent ever plays a3, take the knight. Now, the plan is still to play knight c5, but using the other knight. Reroute to knight fd7. Now go to knight c5. White has to take the knight, of course, because otherwise white will lose a pawn and the game. Probably. After white takes and you capture back, the e5 pawn isn't vulnerable because the knight on c6 protects it. Now, white is going to play some random move and you can just jump your knight into d5 and have a great outpost. You don't have to remember this. You can play this a little bit differently and with a different move order and still most likely be fine. I'm just showing one of the few possible ways to do this. Now, your game isn't going to look exactly like this and you might have to deviate and play a little bit differently, but you can still achieve the same setup and have a very strong position. Instead of teaching you more theory, let's talk about our middle game plan. White's obviously going to move the queen to avoid having it taken. Now, white hopes to play f4 and try to play f5 to take up space on the king side. If we allow this, white will continue with f6 and bust open our king side, probably checkmating us. To prevent f4, we can play queen c7, so that if we see f4, we can snatch it and win a free pawn. If you do accidentally allow f4, just play f6. This protects the e5 pawn, lets you slide your bishop back to f7, and most importantly, prevents white from getting to f6. White doesn't really have any more good options, so expect your opponent to just shuffle their pieces around. Now for your plan, put the rooks in the center. Why? Because it creates long-term protection for your pieces. Now notice that white has better control over the king side, but we have all of the control over the queen side. So as long as we have f4 under control, we can start playing c4, b5, and try to open up the queen side. If your opponent tries to double up the rooks on e2, c4 traps the bishop. Your opponent has almost no good moves. In fact, the best move in this position, according to the engine, is bishop c1. But who in their right mind is going to play bishop c1? So, after something more realistic, we continue with the queenside push that we were talking about. Now, an important note, if we get to a position where we can freely play c4, we should do it, because no matter what white does in this position, we will win some material. This exact position is already -3 in black's favor. Afterwards, the goal is to simply use the massive space advantage to try and win some material. If you do end up winning a pawn, try to use the pawn majority to create a queen. If you win more than a pawn, trade everything down and use the material advantage to win the endgame. Okay, that covers all of knight b3. Back to knight f3. Now, after knight bd7, your opponent's probably going to castle. We can continue our plan of knight c5. Now, white might play rook e1 to protect the endangered e4 pawn. At this point, we've reached our ideal setup, and since there isn't much more theory, let's instead look at an example game to see what black did to convert this position. Black castles and white tries to trade off some pieces. Takes stakes, and black immediately punishes the awkward placement of the bishop with knight a4, attacking both the bishop and the b2 pawn. Queen d4, bishop g4, and now a big mistake, b3. Now why is b3 a mistake? We're about to see. Knight takes c3, queen takes c3, and now bishop takes f3, ruining white's pawn structure and immediately preparing to jump the knight into the f4 outpost with knight h5, while also opening up the queen for attack. King h1, running away from the queen g5 check. Queen f6, attacking f3, bishop e2, defending f3. Now knight f4. Notice how strong this knight is. It cannot be kicked out with any pawns, and it covers so many key squares. Queen e3, queen h4. Entertaining the idea of queen h3 and queen g2 mate, but also placing the queen on just a more active square. Rook g1 and a quick f5 give the rook ideas of going to f6 and h6. A few moves later, this happens, and another few moves later, black is one move away from checkmate. Queen g1 stops mate. Knight h3 happens, and now losing material is inevitable. If the queen moves, knight takes f2 creates a fork, and the queen cannot capture the knight because of the rook. The best move for white is to sacrifice the rook for the knight, and even then, white is in a world of trouble. In the game, white played rook a1 and promptly resigned. This was a game between two international masters, and as we can see, black dominated the game from start to finish. This covers all of the lines involving d4, but what if white decides to do something a little bit different? What if white goes for a different move? The second most popular move is c3, the Alapin, which is slightly more tricky, but thankfully we have a solution for this move as well. e6, d4, d5. If your opponent plays e takes d5, recapture back and then just continue developing normally like this. You're now playing in an isolated queen spawn position, to which I have dedicated an entire video, and it's going to be available in the top right corner, so you guys can check it out if you want to learn how to play in these sort of positions. Now, most of the time, the opponent will push e5. Now we play knight c6. Now, once again, white has a million moves, the most common of which is bishop d3. We respond with bishop d7. Castles, stakes, and now queen b6, simultaneously attacking the d4 pawn and the b2 pawn. This means that if the bishop comes out to e3 to protect the pawn, you can take the pawn on b2 freely. At this point, there are a bunch of moves for white, so let's discuss our plan instead. We want to place our g8 knight on f5 so they can apply pressure to the d4 pawn. This is possible through the common route of e7 to f5. If white is successfully able to defend said pawn, your game might go similar to this, with the knight forcing your queen to retreat, but all you have to do is just develop normally with moves like bishop e7, castles, and rook c8 in any particular order to establish control over the semi-open file. If your f5 knight gets threatened, feel free to take the e3 bishop. Now, let's take a look at the game to see how black converted this position into a win. White reroutes the knight and black correctly plays f6, breaking apart the pawn mass in the center. Takes stakes, and black is able to activate the rook. Knight f4 and g6 prevents any knight h5 ideas. Rook f2 is an attempt to double up on the f-file, and black does the same. Some regular development occurs, and finally, black is prepared to break open the center with e5. Numerous trades occur and the position favors black because of the bishop pair and more active pieces. Bishop c6 to protect the pawn, and now white has a problem. There are no good moves in this position. White's best bet is to literally push the b-pawn to stall or shuffle the pieces around. White naturally tries to reroute the bishop to the active b3 square, but this move opens up a tactical opportunity with the game-winning move, d4. If e4, then d3, and after bishop takes d3, simply bishop d4, pinning the rook and winning material. If e takes d4 instead, then simply bishop takes d4 and the same pattern occurs. At this point, white is lost and white resigns. Now, did this tactic happen because of a plan in our opening? No. Did it come from having better placed pieces in active attack? Absolutely. All in all, your games will never look exactly like this, but you will be able to find game-winning tactics with the same amount of success against the majority of your opponents if you remember our setup and understand the plan. So, here you go. You now know how to effectively play and win with the Sicilian Defense. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so that I can continue to make more videos like this. Thank you.